This is Jane Anderson, and I'm an attorney advisor with Equitas, and today we're going to talk about drugs as coercion, human trafficking, and toxicology. I want to thank everyone for being here with us this afternoon. If any of you are not familiar with Equitas, we are an organization based out of Washington, D.C. that provides technical assistance to prosecutors and allied professionals that work within the criminal justice system on issues involving violence against women. So that includes domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, also stalking, witness intimidation, and elder abuse. So we really strive to provide everyone with very innovative and informed information. So we read the latest research, we take things from ideas from around the country and hopefully provide you with really practical strategies to how to improve your approach to these types of cases. Equitas is available 24/7, either by telephone or email. And we do such things as provide technical assistance, which can be everything from a case consultation to legal research and information about statutory compilations, perhaps. We can identify expert witnesses for you and peer review any resources that you or your organization may be putting out there. We also provide training, including today's webinar, but also in-person and longer form institute-style trainings. We have a lot of written resources, and I invite you to look at our library to see everything from sort of long-form prosecutors' resources to shorter, brief strategies on all types of topics, and some of them we'll be covering today. We are supported by a grant from the Department of Justice, and although we appreciate their funding, we don't necessarily reflect their views when we present our materials. And we also use property of others and research from others, and we do that with permission under fair use. So today, I'm going to be your presenter. I, again, am Jane Anderson. I'm an attorney advisor with Equitas. I've been with Equitas for about 4 years, and prior to that, I served as an assistant state attorney in Miami-Dade County. I started within our misdemeanor domestic violence unit and worked my way through the office, and eventually, as I went back and supervised our domestic violence unit, was asked to co-found our human trafficking unit. We really started doing that type of work back in 2010, and it began with sort of one case that I was handling, although I think there were some prior cases within our office. But it was really that one case that brought it to the attention, and with the support of our elected official, Catherine Fernandez-Rundle, we really started building this task force that ultimately became a standalone unit within our office, and I was dedicated to prosecuting human trafficking cases, and in fact tried many of Florida's first state-level trafficking cases. And as you can imagine, you guys doing the work, that a lot of those cases involve some element of drugs or alcohol. So I think that's where we're going to focus today. And we're going to do that by first sort of recognizing how traffickers are sort of perpetrating their trafficking through and with the assistance of drugs and alcohol. And it kind of takes lots of different forms, and we'll see some of the common ways that we typically see that happen in our cases. We'll look at what the role of drugs and alcohol play in the organizations, and then we'll think about strategies that include collaboration with experts and allied professionals to do a better job of investigating these cases and ultimately prosecuting and holding the offenders accountable. So let's start with talking about sort of the dynamics of human trafficking, the modes, means, and methods. And I think this is really important, and I'm sure there's varying levels of experience on this call, but I think it's great to really kind of step back a little bit and think how human trafficking sort of came into a lot of our consciousnesses fairly recently. And also we have to remember that the general public, those that will be our jurors and make up our jury panels, may still have a lot of those misperceptions that are out there from popular media or from generally just the the name human trafficking can sometimes trigger some thoughts that aren't really realistic to what and how we see it in our communities. What's really important is that those misperceptions can really lead to a basic misunderstanding about what trafficking is, right? So we still hear trafficking really be conflated with smuggling, for example, right? That trafficking must include people being transported over state borders or international borders. So those misunderstandings, if we don't dispel them, we're going to be left with the misidentification of our trafficking victims that are right there in our communities and maybe even were born and raised in our communities. So we want to avoid that, obviously. And I think the really underlying basic tenet of human trafficking is this idea of the vulnerable people within our communities, right? So those that are vulnerable in our communities are really at heightened risk for being victimized by traffickers who are really predators preying upon those vulnerable individuals and then exploiting them, right? So trafficking is not about transportation. It's really about that exploitation, and anyone with vulnerability can be exploited by a trafficker. So what types of vulnerabilities do we usually see in our trafficking cases, right? So those of you that have been working with victims of trafficking, I'm sure you can kind of talk about some common themes that you see. And some of the ones that I've seen and that research bears out are the following, right? So the idea that a lot of our victims come from the foster care system, have some involvement in our dependency courts, or otherwise just really have an unstable home life. That home instability at home is often due to alcohol or substance abuse. So we have alcohol and drugs kind of already coming into this discussion. So it can either be from the homes, or there can be an alcohol or substance abuse issue with our victims themselves that makes them vulnerable to exploitation. Other vulnerabilities, and a lot of these will sort of dovetail with alcohol and substance abuse, are mental health issues, poverty, prior sexual abuse. I think that was probably, and I think the research bears out, the number one indicator of a vulnerability that's exploited by traffickers in the sex trafficking industry, that prior sexual abuse. And we know that those that suffer the trauma of sexual abuse often will rely upon drugs or alcohol. So again, these are issues that sort of overlap. LGBTQ population, and we'll see that amongst youth in particular. Immigrant or refugee status makes someone particularly vulnerable to a trafficker that can easily threaten deportation or other legal process. And then just generally low self-esteem. I like to have that there because I think it talks to and speaks to those cases that we see where there isn't an otherwise obvious vulnerability, and that a trafficker has exploited somebody's sense of low self-esteem and has been able to manipulate them and coerce them into trafficking situations. And it sort of reminds us that all of us and everybody within our community is potentially at danger for these predators. So when we talk about how alcohol and drugs play in, I've seen it in two different ways, right? So there's one of them is that you have a perpetrator, offender, trafficker who identifies those that are already addicted, those are already suffering from substance abuse issues. They identify that individual, and then they use that pre-existing addiction to control them. And then the other way we see it is that the trafficker will sort of introduce drugs or alcohol, or maybe amp up the victim's use of drugs or alcohol to facilitate the trafficking, to sort of allow the victim to stay up all night, or to even maybe break down some inhibitions. So we'll break these down a little bit more. This is a case out of Kansas, and I put it here because it also reminded me of a publication, an article that came out recently about how traffickers were targeting women that were in jail and getting them released on bond. And that's exactly what the defendant in this case did, is that he was convicted of trafficking under the theory that he was abusing legal process. He was actually a bondsman who bonded the women out of jail, identified women that had pre-existing drug problems, bonded them out, and then demanded sex in return and provided them with drugs. So that's a way that we can look at it from that victim selection angle. So the facilitation, how does this work out, right? So this is the other side of things. And it really comes into play both in the grooming process or through that recruitment, right? We use that term grooming sometimes to explain how that recruitment happens. And then also then through the coercion piece. So grooming is really where an offender establishes a relationship with a victim. Often they establish a relationship of trust, often in the form of like a boyfriend-girlfriend, right? Any of you guys that have done work with child abuse victims are probably familiar with this idea in that context. The same process happens with adolescents and older victims as well. So then once that established relationship is built, then the offender uses that relationship to then encourage the victim to do something just barely out of their comfort zone, right? We're going to push the boundary just a little bit and rely upon the trusted relationship for the victim to do that. Eventually, the offender keeps pushing the victim's boundaries further and further until we get to the point of trafficking. Drugs and alcohol can play an important part in this grooming process. It can lower inhibitions, and it can help offenders sort of facilitate this grooming process. In my experience, I saw this play out fairly regularly in trafficking cases where the victim established an intimate relationship with the offender, other way around, and then, eventually encouraged her to maybe work at a strip club as a cocktail waitress, and then maybe dance like amateur night, and then dance, with a little bit of clothes on, and then dance with no clothes on, and then eventually it keeps getting pushed and pushed, and there's going to be commercial sex happening, and then the trafficking really sort of begins at that point. But it's a slow process, and it involves this grooming, and it will also often involve drugs and alcohol. So we look at our power and control wheel, and I'm sure all of you are having problems seeing the small writing there, but I just wanted to illustrate that with trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, we have this power and control wheel, and it's been adapted from what was originally designed to help explain the power and control dynamics of a domestic violence relationship. But here we're talking about it in the context of trafficking. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to your attention is that all the little spokes of the wheel, none of them itself say like drugs and alcohol, but drugs and alcohol can be part and parcel of all the other means of asserting power and control. So let's illustrate that a little bit so we can think about how it's asserted. So let's see. So, and when we talk about drugs and alcohol, I'm sorry, I did skip that one right there. I wanted to point out that we're talking about really any substance. I've heard reports, I've seen myself, pretty much any of these being used to either facilitate trafficking or the pre-existing addiction there. And oftentimes it's going to be, it'll be a combination of these things. So how is it asserted within the power and control? When we looked at the wheel that said coercion and threats, well, those coercion and threats can be threats for arrest for drugs, threats to expose drug use to maybe family or friends, and coercion through drugs. When we look at intimidation, that can be through, hey, drug debts that are looming that have been incurred through the use of drugs, and then also perhaps intimidating the victim into believing that they're going to have involvement with TCS or some sort of court process if they have children and they're using drugs. Emotional abuse, name calling. I'm sure you guys can imagine what kinds of names are being used by traffickers to sort of emotionally abuse victims that are engaging in commercial sex and that are using or abusing illicit circumstances, right? Like no one else will have you, you're a drug addict, and much worse. Isolation. Really, addiction is isolation, right? We call commercial sexual activity and the trafficking that occurs within that, it's often referred to as the life, right? That isolates someone from the rest of society. The traffickers do that on purpose so that the victim doesn't believe they can really sort of re-enter normal society or go straight. Right now they're in the life and they're isolated. And it's an emotional isolation as well as sometimes physical because they're living on the road, they don't have a stable residence, they're working on hours that normal people are not working. There's denying, blaming, or minimizing. So a trafficker could make a victim believe that they are to blame for what's happening to them because of their addiction. Sex abuse, really there can be this normalization that's happening and normalizing the sex for drugs, and it's not really, oh, that's not really commercial sexual activity, this isn't trafficking, this is just a normal way for you to be feeding your drug habit. Physical abuse, you know, and we're just talking in the realm of drugs and alcohol. We also recognize that there's oftentimes some very violent physical abuse that's happening, but also think about the abuse that happens when an offender withholds drugs and forces a victim to go through withdrawal symptoms without any medical care or access to any relief from that. That can be added there. And then using privilege, right? Either the trafficker is their drug dealer and therefore in a position of power and control over them, but also there are some traffickers that really take great pride in the fact that they don't touch drugs, and then they hold themselves in this place of superiority over their own victims that they are facilitating drug-facilitated human trafficking. And then financial abuse, again, there can be these drug debts that are incurred, or the trafficker would just hold on to the money, which then will be controlling the access through the financial abuse. So we're looking at drugs and alcohol as being a way to facilitate human trafficking, and then we look at the different ways of power and control. It's not its own little category when we look at it like this. It's something that impacts all these other ways that traffickers will assert power and control. So let's quickly look about how it shows up in different forms of sex trafficking models. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these three models, and they overlap and they're not exclusive of how we see trafficking happen, but they are common themes that we will recognize. So pimp-controlled trafficking, you know, that's the pimp in the center making his or her victims completely dependent on him, and he therefore plays the role of sort of all these different people to the victim, right? So often he'll play the role of the boyfriend, the manager, security, and drug dealer. So that's the one that really implicates what we're talking about today. He may control one or more victims. There's often a stable and a hierarchy within that, and there's other partners, whether it's other pimps or it can be drug dealers or it can be drivers or even attorneys that sort of play within this world of the pimp-controlled trafficking. One of the things I wanted to point out here, and I'm sorry if you have trouble seeing this on your computer, but this is a real list of rules that this particular trafficker has written, sort of reminding himself how to play this game. And a side note, I've always shocked how much traffickers really, especially this model of trafficking, they really like to write lists and have their victim maybe even write lots of lists and write the rules down as punishment. So I had a lot of cases where there were just ledgers of these types of lists that were really helpful to my case. But here it says, number 1 rules to the game of hoes. Always make them need and depend on you, so you have power over them. Power is control. So just thinking about rule number 1 and then the interplay of that with the trafficker being the victim's drug dealer and the need and the control and the power that comes from that. So the other model is the gang model, and this has a lot more interplay with sort of drug dealing as a separate business, part and parcel of a human trafficking organization a lot of times as well, right? So these we see much more located within communities, not the traveling sort of circuits that you see in the pimp-controlled trafficking. So you'll have, in Miami, we would refer to them as trap houses. I think that might be a regional dialect. But really it's that location within a community, within a jurisdiction, within a community, within a neighborhood where there's lots of drug sales activity. People kind of hang out in the house. Sometimes they're owned, or sometimes they're just solely for the purpose of this drug dealing and prostitution that's happening. More likely in these cases, you'll have multiple offenders. So girls might be owned by the gang, not by a particular person within the gang. But the key to this is loyalty is everything within a gang, right? And there's this just really high prevalence of violence and sex and drugs. And because the female victimization is really integral to this culture, what we're seeing is that trafficking is occurring alongside drug trafficking. Human trafficking is occurring sort of, hey, come to the trap house, you can pick up your drugs and get a girl. Girls are being used between gangs to settle debts. And so this pervasiveness of drugs and girls being trafficked happens within the gang culture. And in fact, I have this case here on USC Lockhart. The gang members here were convicted of sex trafficking, and the testimony within the case actually established that 4 gang members, these that were prosecuted under this case, that they had decided, to prostitute girls instead of selling drugs. So we see that as well, where somebody says, oh, well, this is actually making us more money. We're not having to keep buying and re-upping on our drug possession. We can just keep selling the girls. And less likely anyone's going to identify this within these types of communities. The officers that are investigating the gang activity or the drug activity aren't necessarily, trained to identify that the human trafficking is also happening alongside it. So this is a low-risk, high-reward situation for gang members. I also just wanted to take note of this case. The court ruled that the victim's prior and subsequent prostitution was properly excluded. And I just point this out because this often comes up in all human trafficking cases, and there's some good case law out there that says it can be excluded in our case. So took a little diversion there, but wanted to point it out. So the other model that we want to look at is this model of the family model, and it kind of plays out in 2 different ways. One is a biological family or a foster family, where there's sort of a head of a family. Oftentimes there is this drug addiction within the family, multiple generations that are within the life. It intersects with child pornography, and often the investigations that come across this type of trafficking are more traditional child pornography investigations. So your ITAC team should be trained to be looking at these cases not just as child pornography and child exploitation, but human trafficking. More likely to see boys victimized. They also tend to be younger. All of this sort of skews a little bit younger, and they can be advertised and sold online through chat rooms and through peer-to-peer networks, again, which is more in line with child pornography than, let's say, the typical online advertisements that we see in our more adolescent and adult human trafficking cases, what used to be Backpage. So this I saw often playing out where a mother with a drug addiction had children and also fed her drug addiction by having maybe sort of less formal commercial sex contracts with boyfriends, with guys in the neighborhood that knew that, if they came over to her house, she needed groceries, she'd provide them with sex, and she'd get a little bit of money and be able to support herself. And then at some point, her own children are then being targeted by these men that are coming to the house, and the mother or father who's supporting the drug habit will sort of allow these men to maybe have some access to her own children. And in fact, this particular case, there was a mother that was convicted of sex trafficking her own daughter, and she had brought her 16-year-old, which is sort of skewing higher in age than we sometimes see, brought her daughter to her drug dealer's house. The drug dealer had told her that he wanted to see her daughter's breasts, and the mother responded, 2 tits, 2 morphine. So subsequently at the house, the drug dealer not only was flashed per the mother's instructions to her daughter, but he also took her into the room, fondled her, and took naked photos of the daughter. This was eventually disclosed because the daughter wrote to her boyfriend, and her boyfriend revealed this, that the mother was willing to use my body to feed her addiction. So that's how it often will play out in that family model. But we also see what we refer to as sort of the street family model. And this is where kids that have run away or they're thrown out of their homes, often because they are LGBTQ plus children and don't feel welcome in their homes or are literally thrown out of their homes. Now they are on the street and will find like people to sort of form a street family. There can be, again, multi-generations, wide range of ages that are going to then make up the sort of family that's on the street. And trafficking comes in because of, I think this term is sort of going out of favor, but this idea of survival sex. So it falls into the legal definition of commercial sex, but it's often not going to be sex for money initially. It's usually sex for a place to stay, for food, or for drugs. And then that kind of turns into a trafficking situation. Now, if a minor is involved, it's trafficking. Survival sex is trafficked. That child is a victim of sex trafficking. And not only are we talking about food and a place to stay, but if we are looking at transgender victims, we've also seen cases where hormones are provided or withheld or are used to procure the commercial sex. And this is just some statistics about how any child that is fleeing or kicked out of their homes, the likelihood that they are engaging in sex for food or a place to stay is about 1/3 of those children. And anytime we see stats like this, I'm always reminding myself that these are underreported crimes. And so I would always say that whatever the stat is, that's going to be that's the bottom range of what's really happening out there. So the thing that has all of this in common is this idea of family and loyalty and acceptance and love, right? That's the underlying theme when we talk about all of the models of sex trafficking. So I also just wanted to bring up this idea that labor trafficking shouldn't be left out of the equation. There's a real interconnectedness between labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and sexual assault. And drugs and alcohol will play a piece in this as well. So we've seen sex trafficking and labor trafficking co-occurring. The best example I can think of to illustrate it is sort of where there's labor trafficking of men in maybe an agricultural setting, and then traffickers have also set up a residential brothel that is serving those men that are being trafficked within the agricultural setting. And the same traffickers could actually be controlling both of those venues. And there's this real like interconnectedness between them. We also see sex assault as a means of force, fraud, and coercion within labor trafficking. Sex assault can be that force. Great documentary called Rape in the Fields that illustrates that point really well. And then of course sex trafficking and sex assault are just hand in hand. And this case is actually out of Florida, U.S. v. Evans, and the defendants in this case went around and they recruited homeless, drug-addicted men off of the streets. And then they brought the men to a working farm, and they had the men work in the fields, work at the farm all day, and at the end of the day, they provided them with drugs in order to control them and to continue to facilitate that forced labor. The defendants in this case were actually convicted of only drug-related crimes, but it also illustrates the point that we should be investigating these cases on and we'll talk a little bit more about charging, but they didn't need to have the testimony of the victims in the case necessarily, because they were able to go after them on these drug charges, and they were very serious drug charges. So they were able to hold the offenders accountable for that while they were able to sort of, what was I going to say? Sorry about that. Anyway, so they were holding them accountable on alternative charges, which is always good to be thinking about. So this case illustrates a couple of things. One, these are U.S. citizens that were labor trafficked within the United States. That's something most people think about. They were male victims of human trafficking, also something that we sometimes forget about, and that they were these pre-existing drug-addicted men, this very highly vulnerable community that maybe we're not looking at when we're trying to see who might be a victim of trafficking. So let's look at the actual statutory analysis of how we can charge these cases and actually prosecute traffickers of drug-facilitated human trafficking. So we're going to use the federal law to sort of illustrate this, but all states have their own state human trafficking laws as well, and most of them sort of fit the same model. So this analysis of act, means, and purpose can be very helpful for when you're looking at your own state case, or we're maybe using the federal case that we'll do here. So here's the sex trafficking and how it breaks down. So to prove sex trafficking, you need to prove an element from each of these columns, right? So 3 elements and only 1 from the column. So any of these acts will substantiate a human trafficking charge. So oftentimes it's the recruitment, or it's somebody that is maintaining or harboring a victim, but it also includes most recently advertising a victim and patronizing and soliciting a victim. So any of those acts, and then let me skip to the purpose. Under sex trafficking, the purpose is commercial sexual activity. Most of the time we're talking about prostitution. There is some room for argument that it could also include stripping, webcam performances, forced pornography. And then the real meat of it is the middle one, right, the means, this force, fraud, and coercion. When we're talking about an adult victim, we need to prove force, fraud, and coercion. If it's a minor victim, we don't even need to prove that. Of course, we always want to be investigating our cases and building our evidence and illustrating force, fraud, and coercion when we can. So let's look at labor trafficking. Looks pretty much the same. The language is a little bit different, little different acts. It's not as lengthy. And the means are, instead of force, fraud, and coercion, you've got a little bit more unwieldy terminology, but we typically also just refer to this as force, fraud, and coercion. And we look at any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the person to believe that if they did not perform the label, they would suffer serious harm or constraint. That language mirrors the definition of coercion, so it's still really easy for us to use force, fraud, and coercion when we're talking about labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking. So coercion, like I said, it really mirrors that language that we just saw in the labor trafficking statute. It includes threats of serious harm or physical restraint. Thinking about serious harm, would withdrawal from a particular drug meet that definition? I think there could be an argument, especially if you had a medical professional, an expert witness that was able to say really what that withdrawal was and to comport that with what serious harm is. But really we're going to probably be looking at any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that the failure to perform an act would result in serious harm or physical restraint against any person. And then, of course, the last one we shouldn't forget about, because the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process could be the threat of arrest, the threat of deportation, the threat of having your kids taken away from you. So all of those could be because of the drugs and alcohol involved. So we really can see it in any of these 3 subsets of what coercion is defined under the federal statute. Wanted to point out that when it says serious harm, if you look at the actual definition, you might have thought it meant physical harm, but it's very clear that any harm, whether physical, non-physical, including psychological, financial, or reputational harm that is sufficiently serious, and note, under all the surrounding circumstances, so we want to look at the victim's perspective, to compel a reasonable person, but a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances. These are going to be the keys when we're looking at that victim selection piece. We're going to want to be arguing this victim is in a has a particular background, has a particular circumstance that makes this coercion, makes this serious harm. So drugs as coercion, there are really 2 seminal cases that stand for the position that that drugs can be coercion. So first I'm going to really go through is the USC Fields, and then I'll give you the secondary site as well. The defendant in this case was convicted of sex trafficking, and he'd actually offered victims drugs, money, and a place to live if they prostituted for him. I wanted to include this fact because I think a lot of people might think of this fact as a bad fact. Initially, these victims were already using drugs, and they walked into this situation knowing that they would be engaging in prostitution. Most of us don't like those facts from the prosecution side, right? Because that tends to undermine our theory that this is not voluntary, right? Our jurors are expecting this person to be an innocent victim when they became trafficked. So this case really stands for the fact that a victim can already be using drugs and initially consent to the agreement or consent to the situation, and then it can turn into trafficking. In this case, the defendant basically kept increasing the drug addictions, kept upping how dependent they were on the drugs, and then used that to coerce the victims into continuing to engage in the commercial sex, right? So again, continuing to engage, right? It went from, quote, consensual to absolutely not consensual, coerced commercial sex. He did that by withholding the drugs. The victims were able to testify that when they were withheld the drugs, they experienced withdrawal symptoms that made them want to die. And then the defendant also sort of isolated these victims so that they had no other place to obtain the drugs than from the defendant. They were wholly dependent and really subservient to the defendant because he had set it up that way, right? And then he would also sort of track their debts, and so it sort of introduced this debt bondage as part of the trafficking as well. And then the other thing I wanted to just point out here was that in the case, the jury was actually instructed that they could consider the victim's potential vulnerabilities. Again, harking back to that definition that I put out about what serious harm was, and the idea that we're supposed to be looking at it through the victim's eyes, or at least considering the victim's circumstances and background when we're looking at that. And the jury in this case was instructed that way. The case was upheld. The other case that really stands for this drugs as coercion is listed here. See also United States v. Mack. Encourage you to look at it as well. So the other way that this is played out is through, remember, force, fraud, and coercion, fraud. So in this case, the defendant was found guilty of sex trafficking by fraud, and he had lured victims to South Florida with the promise of filming them in a commercial. And then once they arrived, he drugged them and then had sex with them while they were unconscious. He filmed the sex and sold the movies online. And so they actually charged this under a theory of fraud, and it worked. And to be noted, there was an expert at that trial that was able to talk about the drugs that were used and what the effects of those drugs were on these particular victims. So how can you identify drug facility human trafficking in your jurisdiction? I'll go through a couple of these. I think it's important that we look at it from sort of multifaceted, right? So within the prosecutor's office, the idea of setting up a system where all cases are screened. There are particular types of cases that I think should have heightened screening. In Miami, we've, sort of a larger office. We pinpointed our domestic violence unit, our juvenile unit, our gang unit to have this particular training that said, okay, when cases come in, sort of look for any of these red flags, and then at the time I served as that human trafficking point person and really say, okay, this is my email, it's my phone number. If you see any red flags, just email me and I'll look at it. It took the onus off of the whole staff having to know everything about human trafficking. I also made it really clear that, hey, I want to cast this net wide. I'd rather you send me, every little suspicion you have and me look at it than you go, nah, I don't really know. I don't want to bother Jane with this. So that worked out really well within our office. And so when we're looking, if you've got a particular drug unit, or we just had sort of a screening unit, a general screening unit that I did some really, one afternoon, not even an hour or two of training with the staff that were screening those cases and just said, hey, this is the kind of stuff to look for. Also, prosecutor's office should have, you have most likely pre-existing relationships with service providers within your community, whether it be the DV shelter or rape crisis center, or you may have specialized human trafficking service providers. Make sure that you're having those conversations with those partners that already exist, maybe even building capacity within some partnerships. and then to be looking at maybe even beyond your typical service providers you might work with and think about, okay, maybe we should be looking at people that are providing services to the homeless, to the drug addicted, to the mentally ill. These are high-risk populations for drug-facilitated human trafficking. And then the other one is the defense bar. A lot of cases will come to you because the victims, these same vulnerabilities to trafficking make them vulnerable to arrest. And so we don't have our eyes and ears on everybody that's arrested, but the defense bar definitely does. And if there's a trusted relationship where the defense bar knows that the prosecutor's office doesn't want to be prosecuting victims, is interested in holding offenders accountable, trafficking offenders accountable, you may have defense attorneys in the public defender's office or even private attorneys that are able to call you up and say, like, hypothetically, I'm working with a client who X, Y, and Z. You may be able to get inroads on some trafficking through that way. And happy to expand on any of these if you want to reach out to me later. So within the law enforcement, training, roll calls, try to get this information out to as many, sort of first line of defense people as possible, right? Even if you've got a dedicated human trafficking unit, we know that the way that our victims are going to be intersecting with law enforcement is not just directly through your detective and your specialized unit. It's going to be through your patrol officers, through those, that are responding to overdoses, that those are, patrolling particular high-risk areas. So as best as you can, you should be pushing out training. Hopefully it's getting more prevalent to be happening within the academy, but you can also get really simple roll call videos, or prosecutors should be, maybe offering them their time to sort of do these quick trainings during various shifts to cover as many kind of bodies as possible. And then specialized units that we know are going to intersect should have enhanced training. So our narcotics unit, our missing persons unit, maybe even our domestic violence unit, our gang unit, however you guys want to look at your own jurisdictions to say, okay, who should get this information, and then really reach out for training, and Equitas can help you with that. And then partnering with other agencies, whether that be your federal law enforcement partners or even your sort of administrative agencies. So Department of Labor, Department of Alcohol and Tobacco, all sorts of sort of administrative agencies that can help you with your investigation, can have eyes and ears where you cannot, because law enforcement needs a search warrant to get into a certain business, but a code inspector can go in without one. So that partnership can be really key. And then otherwise, look in your communities and see, okay, where can we make, partnerships, or at least do some awareness training so people can have a greater understanding of what trafficker really looks like, right? Those misperceptions, breaking those down. So there's been a real push to do this within the medical community. Just got back from New York, where they were actually letting me know they have recent legislation that mandates that all medical professionals have human trafficking training, just like they did with domestic violence training 20, 30 years ago. But not just your hospitals, but your urgent care clinics. Research shows that most victims of trafficking, by far, most victims of trafficking have intersected with the medical community within their trafficking situation, and nobody kind of picked up on it. And then, of course, within the schools, within our communities, often be invited to go speak at a church, really accepts those invitations so you can get the word out as far and wide as possible. And then I put here rehab facilities. There have been some trafficking cases that have occurred directly out of rehab facilities. Again, my reference point is South Florida, but there's a community where in South Florida, there are a lot of these types of halfway homes and rehab facilities, and they're target-rich environment if you're looking to exploit people. So make those partnerships and see if you can bridge that as well. So that's our way to get as many people out there looking to identify victims of trafficking and drug-facilitated human trafficking. Because it really does take this very coordinated response, right? So we talked a lot about the law enforcement. I'm going to go into the prosecution piece and give some trial strategies in a little bit. But additional to that, we've really got to make sure we're coordinating with our service providers. They're the ones that are actually doing the work on the ground to care for these victims and provide them with any number of services, including housing, which you can separately reach out to as well, or your housing departments within your communities, but service providers are providing short-term shelter, they're providing counseling, access to medical care. They're really the heart of how we're going to make this a victim-centered approach. So as well as reaching out to our medical communities to provide support, victims of drug-facilitated human trafficking are going to have medical issues that need to be taken care of both on an acute and long-term basis. Our toxicology partners, when we are going to trial and we're trying to, sort of make our argument that however this drug-facilitated trafficking happened, we may need to educate our judges and our juries about why this particular drug was used or what the effects of this drug were. And our toxicologists can be a great help. We're not usually, looking at a toxicologist in these cases to actually do a blood draw on our victim. That's not required. But if our victim is testifying, oh, he always gave me this drug in the morning and this drug at night, our victim isn't in a place to tell us exactly what the effects were, but our toxicologist can say, well, just as an educational point of view, not vouching for the victim, but as an educational point of view, this is what that would have done, and this is why a trafficker might use this particular drug or this combination of drugs. And then our housing departments can really be helpful, especially if we're looking for those long-term solutions for victims of trafficking. Okay, so I think I covered most of the victim services that we want to be thinking about, and this is not exhaustive in any means, but these are primarily what we are going to be looking for. Our sexual assault nurse examiners can be really important to our cases. Not only can they provide that acute medical care for victims that need medical care. I mean, SANEs do a lot more than just, forensic, evidence collecting. SANEs also provide medical care, really important and thoughtful and medical care to our victims, and they can let the victim know, like, we are actually care about you. We want to make sure you're safe. We want to make sure you're healthy. We want to make sure you know the short-term and long-term effects of what's happening and provide you with access to ongoing medical care. SANEs can do that as well as other medical professionals, but I just want to shout out, I think the SANE is a role that is underutilized in our trafficking cases. Okay, so this is sort of what we're looking at, just to illustrate the complexity of the victim that is presenting to us, right? So this is someone that has maybe lived a lifetime of neglect or abuse, sexual, physical, emotional. Their vulnerabilities are now being used and abused, and we've got that control that's happening, this lifetime of broken promises, ongoing trauma, and then we're adding addiction to the mix. And so to support a victim that has experienced all of this, we'll harken back to that coordinated response that we need. But when we're looking at actually investigating drug-facilitated human trafficking, I think a key thing to think about is that we need to meet the immediate needs of the victim, right? So we need to be thinking about the victim first. Our investigation doesn't get any better if we don't do that, right? So if we try to force something where a victim hasn't had his or her immediate needs met, we're not doing ourselves any favors. We need to provide them access to appropriate services. Those services should not be dependent on their cooperation with us. We know victims will not self-identify. The access to those services should be independent of whether they've given us a statement that we want or they're ready to testify against their offender. This all goes to sort of thinking about it on a macro level, that we're instilling trust and rapport within communities and with this particular individual. So even if they're not willing to sort of cooperate now, that door is still open to them. When we are in a place that we are investigating trafficking, we want to be doing an evidence-based investigation. We just recorded a webinar that I can give you guys access to. The whole webinar is just on this idea of an evidence-based human trafficking investigation. But the idea is that you want to be doing an investigation from the beginning thinking that a victim may not be able to participate. so that your investigation is not reliant on that victim testimony or on that victim statement. You're doing the job of all that corroborating evidence, all those additional witnesses, all the financial records, all the digital records, all the forensic examinations, so that at the end of the day, even if you don't have a victim willing to participate, even if you can't go forward on a human trafficking charge in and of itself, you may be able to go forward on the other charges, on perhaps those drug trafficking charges. In fact, one of my first cases that I prosecuted in Florida, it was a minor victim, and we ended up with convictions because the defendant admitted that he had given her drugs. Sort of admitted this and like, I'm a good guy. Like, I made sure she wasn't on the streets. She was able to prostitute out of my apartment. I made sure I gave her just enough drugs so she didn't overdose, blah, blah, blah. Well, he didn't realize that every time he admitted that he had given her drugs, that was a 15-year maximum sentence per charge. Guy gets convicted of that, and I think he was ultimately sentenced to 28 years on essentially the drug charges, not the trafficking charges. So that's a way to conduct an evidence-based investigation. When we are interviewing our victims, we want to be doing it in a trauma-informed manner and appropriate. We have to realize that, hey, this isn't going to be one interview and done, right? There's going to be multiple interviews. We're going to be building rapport and trust. We're also going to recognize from the outset that the story is going to change, that that memories can be affected by drugs, alcohol, trauma, but also just distrust of police can affect, the victim's ability to disclose truthfully. So we just need to be prepared for that, not surprised by that, and just be willing to work with it. But the key really is that maintain that consistent contact. And of course, with this population of victims, that can be really difficult, right? So let's think about who that victim does maintain contact with. Can we find an ally, a sister, a best friend, that ally that we can kind of keep our contact line of communication open? So with our interviews, we want to really assess the victim's ability to relate accurate information, right? So that's the idea of, is she too high, too drunk to have an interview taken? We all know that you don't have to have a completely sober person on the other side of the table to conduct an interview or interrogation, but we really should make an initial assessment of, do they know where they are? Are they able to sort of relate time and place, that kind of thing. We want to create an atmosphere that encourages truthful disclosure. But we've got to understand that we can't do that foolproof, right? One of the things that we can do is you can work with your prosecutor to confer immunity for any sort of small crimes that the victim may be worried about, drug possession or prostitution. And so hopefully when you're able to do that, that can kind of create that atmosphere. But considering that trauma of the drugs and the alcohol to their ability to perceive and recall events. There's some great resources out there on trauma-informed interviewing, on the effect of trauma on memory, and Equitas can put you in contact with more of that if you're interested. One of the things that we have learned from the research is that while trauma affects memory, sort of maybe time and place, the memories that remain the strongest, even when a victim has experienced trauma, are those sensory details, those emotional responses, and those physiological effects. So here's some examples of trauma-informed questioning that we can maybe start with to get better information from our victims instead of trying with a who, what, where, when. Start thinking about, like, how did that make you feel? Do you remember seeing anything? Can you think of a smell? Those are questions that can trigger great memories, and also they lend themselves to getting answers from a victim that are very visceral and that jurors connect with. That description of the smell of stale beer or, somebody's breath that smelled like cigarette smoke. Everybody can kind of feel and recognize those descriptions. And if you can make those visceral connections between how a victim is reporting their experience and the jury perceiving it, you're building credibility in that regard. But there's also this magic word called able. I love it. And how does it play out, right? The magic word able. So we do this in our interviews and also during our direct examinations. What are you able to tell me about? What are you able to remember? This magic word, it does a bunch of things. One of them is it communicates to the victim, hey, like, I understand you may not be able to. I'm allowing you to tell me that. And I'm understanding that there's some impact of trauma there without saying it, right? We also, the jury is going to hear that as well. Their expectations are going to be lowered by the way we ask that question. It allows victims to say, you know, I can't remember that. Instead of asking, you know, a more pointed question where a victim really feels like, oh my gosh, I need to come up with an answer, and sometimes fills in the blank because they want to give us that information because it sounds to them that we desperately need to know, you know, the color of his shirt. But if we say, are you able to remember the color of his shirt? You know, it's much easier for a victim to say no, and it's much easier for a jury to then understand why the victim might not be able to say yes. So quickly, we're going to go through some of the prosecution pieces of it, starting with charging and pretrial litigation and trial strategies. The real key is to look at all those bad facts, all those challenging facts that we have in a case, and think about how can we switch it up and make it a strength. You know, we've got a victim who is going to, you know, testify that she was addicted to heroin, that she still is addicted to heroin. She's still using heroin. How do we make that that perceived challenge, like that doesn't sound great, how do we make it into a strength? Well, we turn it upside down and we say, yeah, and that's why he picked her. And that's why he thought he could get away with it. And that's why he thinks no one's going to believe her. And so that's how he perpetrated his trafficking. So victim selection and offender escaping accountability are the two pieces I really rely on to turn those challenges into strengths. Oh, we have some. Okay, sorry about that. So from charging, you want to be offender focused. So thinking about those victim selection, thinking about the grooming tactics that were involved, that coercive behavior. But then really think also of the co-occurring crimes that you may be able to charge. My three favorite are those narcotic offenses, but also think about money laundering and racketeering. Two of my favorite things to charge in human trafficking cases, really underutilized, really much simpler to charge and prosecute than you might think. Money laundering can be as simple as the offender has no other source of income. All of his income comes from the proceeds of prostitution. And with those proceeds, he rented a hotel room, rented a car, and bought drugs. Money laundering. And again, if you want more information or you want us to look at your state statute and see how it might fit, you know, reach out to Equitas and we can do a deeper dive for you on that. Key is our discovery obligations, right? We never want to be held to the wall having not done this. So we have to recognize our evidence may keep coming in on drug-facilitated human trafficking, any human trafficking cases. We've got subpoenas coming in, results from search warrants, forensic examinations, really make sure we're on top of it. But in particular, we need to be prepared for that statements are going to change. Right? If we're looking at who this victim is, remember all those wheels and all those differing things that are affecting our victim? If we put the victim with services, or the victim maybe relapses and comes back and relapses and comes back during the course of our case, we're going to have changes in our statements, and we just need to make sure we provide them to the defense. Don't be afraid of them. Acknowledge them in court. I think, again, it's a way to think about how can we change that perceived challenge into a strength. It's a strength that, and it's expected that trauma has affected the victim this way. Brady and Giglio will be implicated, whether it's because you conferred immunity for a prostitution charge, or you helped a victim get into rehab, or you gave her a hamburger. It all gets implicated. Just put it all out there. You can deal with it. No big deal. Co-defendants, you know, these are cases where we may have co-defendants that are flipping on people. We may have a drug dealer that's willing to testify against a trafficker. How do we deal with that? Those are basic trial strategies that I think you guys can handle. And then defense motions to compel things. Usually they want to know everything bad that ever happened to your victim. Really be strong when you are countering and litigating those motions to compel. Protect your victim's privacy, protect her or his safety by doing that. Here are some of the motions in limine that I think you might come across in these cases. Really the idea of other bad acts of the trafficker. You should be investigating those and moving to introduce them into court. Looking at the offender's criminal history, doing a criminal history analysis. Oftentimes you'll find former victims that were never identified as trafficking victims, they show up looking like domestic violence victims. They may be out of the life. They may be in a position to testify at this point and really strengthen your case. Rape shield should apply to victims of trafficking. Sometimes you don't want to exclude it because it's part and parcel of your vulnerability and your victim selection, but think about that carefully. And then just, we always encourage you to, before trial, go through your statements. Do you have those non-hearsay statements? Words of solicitation or verbal acts, not hearsay, can establish your commercial sex act without the victim testifying. Lots of exceptions to hearsay that will be implicated, and forfeiture by wrongdoing when you have witness tampering. And again, that's a place where Equitas has a lot of resources, so reach out to us if you're interested in learning more about how forfeiture by wrongdoing can strengthen your human trafficking cases. And when it comes to experts, you can have experts on victim dynamics and toxicology, and probably any number of other things in our trafficking cases. But our drug-facilitated trafficking cases, you maybe want to reach out to your toxicologist, your medical professionals. SANES may be able to provide basic expert testimony as to drugs and alcohol and their effects on the victim. Jury selection is key in this case. In these cases, you've got to be educating your jury, instilling empathy, managing expectations, right? We don't want the jury to be expecting a 100% innocent Catholic schoolgirl on the stand, and we're presenting our victim that has suffered with abuse and neglect her whole life. It's a great quote that says, hey, our jurors might be expecting, that our victims were on a shipping container with a ball attached to the leg. And when we don't have that victim, we need to manage expectations, right? So expectations and reality, not always the same thing. We can manage that all the way from picking a jury to our opening statement and then throughout our trial. You guys have the expert testimony law right there. Lots of different areas of expertise, everything from that medical evidence to the dynamics. I've included a bunch of case law here. If you download the PDF, you'll have access to all of that. But it's really well-received case law about how this is admissible to explain dynamics of sex trafficking, contributing factors that make victims vulnerable to trafficking, and that this expert testimony really provides a framework so that the jury can look at the evidence, look at the testimony through the correct lens, right? That trauma-informed lens, the lens that explains the effects of drugs and alcohol on a victim. And we want to be using those experts at every stage of our trial, not just at trial. These experts can really help inform us during our investigations when we're making those charging decisions. Bring them in earlier. They are a partner to us, and they help us educate us and others. So going forward, really analyze the offender's behavior, whether the drugs or alcohol were part of the recruitment, grooming process, or they're used to assert power and control in any variety of ways. And then charge your co-occurring crimes so that at the end of the day, with or without victim participation, you're able to hold the offender accountable. And a real key to all of our success in this is that collaboration, so that we're taking a victim-centered approach, but at the same time, we're going to be able to hold those offenders accountable. So thank you guys for your time. You can reach Equitas on any number of social media platforms. We're always posting about our trainings, our upcoming webinars, and really encourage you guys to follow up with us about any of the things I sort of mentioned throughout the webinar about forfeiture by wrongdoing or expert witnesses, because there's a lot of information. We don't want you guys to be reinventing the wheel, and because we appreciate what you're doing every day in the field and helping with the work combating human trafficking and drug-facilitated human trafficking. That's my information. If you want to reach out directly, thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And this is Emily from Equitas. Thanks, everyone, for your attention. We have recorded this, so we'll be sending it out. And if you didn't get a chance to download the presentation slides, we'll send that out as well as Jane's full biography. But thanks so much for signing in on a Friday afternoon, and we hope that you have a good weekend, and we'll be in touch with you soon.